In today's video, we're going to review the inflation situation. So we're going to begin with the CPI inflation reports, and then we're going to move on to Trump's tariff policies, how that affects inflation, and what you can expect. So the CPI inflation report was released this Thursday morning, April 10th. So CPI headline inflation fell from 2.8% in February to 2.4% in March. Now CPI core inflation, which excludes food and energy prices, has fallen from 3.1% in February to 2.8% in March. So inflation came in much lower than expected. But you have to keep in mind that these are the inflation rates for March, which includes minimal impact from the tariffs. And here you can see how CPI headline inflation and CPI core inflation have been trending over the past few years. And please remember that the goal is to get the rate of inflation here at 2%. Okay, now I want to show you this. So here's what happened year over year, and this is coming from the CPI inflation reports. Energy inflation is negative 3.3%, so energy prices are down year over year. So it was the falling energy prices that helped to suppress the overall rate of inflation. Gasoline prices fell by 6.3% in March. Now, services inflation is up 3.7%. And according to the Federal Reserve, so they've said this multiple times, they are no longer concerned about services inflation adding meaningfully to overall inflation. Now, shelter inflation came in at 4.0%. Now, this one is expected to slowly fall down. And I say expected because this is actually based on a formula with lagging information. However, it's gotten really sticky here at 4%. Food inflation came in at 3.0%. Month over month, the price of eggs are up by 5.9%. And year over year, the price of eggs are up 60.4%. Year over year, butter is up 5.5%. Coffee is up 6.7%. Meats are up 4.6%. And milk is up by 2.9%. Okay, so that was March. Now let's talk about where inflation is headed. So we're going to start with the Federal Reserve. I'm going to show you this video clip of Jay Powell, and you're going to see that he says that tariffs will cause a temporary rise in inflation. But you're going to see that he says that it's possible that it's more than just temporary. He says that it depends on how the tariff situation develops. So please take a look.
We have stressed that it will be very difficult to assess the likely economic effects of higher tariffs until there is greater certainty about the details, such as what will be tariffed, at what level, and for what duration, and the extent of any retaliation from our trading partners. While uncertainty remains elevated, it is now becoming clear that tariff increases will be significantly larger than expected. And the same is likely to be true of the economic effects, which will include higher inflation and slower growth. The size and duration of these effects remains uncertain. While tariffs are highly likely to generate at least a temporary rise in inflation, it's also possible that the effects could be more persistent.
Now, I want to show you this video clip of Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. So he says that tariffs are inflationary, but he says that it's going to be a one-time thing. So essentially, he's saying that it's going to be temporary. So please take a look.
Let me ask you about your view, because last January you wrote that, quote, tariffs are inflationary. The Fed chair said the same thing on Friday, that tariffs announced this week cause higher inflation. Have you expressed any concerns to President Trump directly that his tariff policy could be inflationary?
No, what I've said is tariffs are a one-time price adjustment. So there's a big difference between insipid endemic inflation within the system and consistent price level increases and a one-time adjustment.
And now I want to show you this video clip of President Trump. So he gets asked about inflation and he says that it's no big deal. So please take a look.
Into late summer, early fall, and people are doing their back-to-school shopping. Do you think they'll have inflation to worry about at that point?
I think there's not going to be. I don't think inflation is going to be a big deal, because if you look at me, I took in hundreds of billions of dollars. This is not new to me. I took in during my 4 years hundreds of billions of dollars from China, and we also took in a lot of money from other countries, but in particular China, because it was just getting started, and we had no inflation. Who had inflation was Biden. Biden had the worst inflation in the history of our country. I had no inflation.
Okay, so you just saw that, but I need to say this to clarify the situation. So President Trump said that in his previous term, he did his tariffs, it brought in hundreds of billions of dollars, and it did not cause inflation. But you have to read the fine print. So his tariffs brought in $200 billion over the past 8 years. So that's $25 billion a year for the US government. That is nothing. That is peanuts. The government, the federal government spends $20 billion a day. So the tariffs he did before, they're peanuts. They brought in a small amount of money. They were small tariffs, and that's why it had a small impact on inflation. So just to clarify. Okay, now let's move on to the Federal Reserve, and let's start with their dilemma. So here's the problem. Cutting interest rates helps the economy and the labor market, but also fuels inflation. So cutting interest rates is basically a trade-off. But what should the Federal Reserve do if the labor market weakens and inflation goes up? Should they save the economy and the labor market by cutting interest rates and let inflation shoot up again? Or should they let the economy and the labor market weaken and keep inflation under control? So the Federal Reserve released their minutes from their last meeting, and they acknowledged this dilemma. So they said this on page 11, that the committee may face difficult trade-offs if inflation proves to be more persistent and the outlook for growth and employment weaken. So will the Federal Reserve prioritize rescuing the economy and the labor markets or fighting inflation? So if you remember from my last video, Jay Powell said that the Federal Reserve will focus on the problem that becomes more severe. And right now, it appears that the Federal Reserve is more concerned about inflation. Now, Federal Reserve Governor Adriana Kugler just said it should be a priority to make sure that inflation doesn't move up. We want to keep it that way. We, all colleagues at the Fed, are very committed still to our 2% target, and we want to keep inflation expectations well anchored, which should be a priority now. And not to mention that Jay Powell insists that the economy and the labor market are solid, but he expects no progress on inflation this year. So again, it appears that they're concentrating on fighting inflation. I'm not saying that they're doing a good job at it, but you know what I'm saying. Now, I want to show you this. So the majority of Americans believe that tariffs will cause prices of everyday goods to increase. However, when are prices going to start to increase? So I just want you to know that these tariffs that just went into effect, like the 104% on China, the universal 10%, the auto tariffs, etc., many of these products get a grace period that are already in transit. So many of the goods that are coming in right now will not pay a tariff until later in April or May. Even the de minimis tariffs for Chinese imports that are $800 or less, they don't go into effect until May 2nd. However, retailers can do whatever they want. They can start raising their prices at any time, even if their products are not being tariffed yet. But in about 2 months, the tariffs, yes, they're going to be in full force. So I'm referring to the tariffs that I just mentioned that did not get paused for the 90 days. Now, I want you to see this. The Federal Reserve has their next meeting on May 7th. According to the CME Fed Watch tool, before today's CPI inflation report, there was an 83% chance that the Federal Reserve does not cut interest rates at that May meeting. Now, after the report, there is now a 73.4% chance that the Federal Reserve does not cut rates. So the rate of inflation came in better than expected. Therefore, there's a little bit of a better chance of the Federal Reserve cutting interest rates, but the odds are still stacked against that from happening. And the next meeting after that one's going to take place on June 18th. So before the CPI inflation report this morning, there was a 72% chance that the Federal Reserve will cut interest rates by that meeting. After the reports, the odds of an interest rate cut by that meeting have increased from 72% to 88.1%. Again, that's because inflation came in better than expected. However, again, we'll see how much and how quickly the tariffs will impact inflation in the upcoming weeks and months ahead. So that's your inflation update. Please subscribe. I'll keep you updated on the whole situation. Thank you for the support, and I wish you a very nice day.